Hello and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 3.2 and we'll be talking about aggregate supply. So recall from our last module, we touched upon a little bit about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. The ADAS model allows us to understand how our economy is functioning and what is happening specifically in terms of long-run economic growth and why we have short-run economic fluctuations. It helps explain why we have fluctuations in the price level as well as fluctuations in output. We will focus our discussion today specifically on the long-run aggregate supply curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. And we'll explain why we have to think about the aggregate supply curve in the long term versus the short term. So to start off with, when we think about the long run, what we see is that nominal and real variables are separated in the long run. This is what we call the classical dichotomy. Specifically, what we observe is that changes in nominal variables do not affect real variables in the long run. So therefore, when we have changes in the price level, inflation, money supply, they're not going to impact real GDP. On the other hand, in the short run, nominal and real variables are more closely intertwined, and this classical dichotomy breaks down. Therefore, what we observe is that changes in the price level, changes in money supply, will have an impact on real variables such as real GDP, unemployment, etc. So let's focus our discussion now on the aggregate supply in the long run. In the long run, as I just mentioned, nominal and real variables are separated so that nominal variables have no impact on real variables. And supply in the long run is going to be determined simply by the number of available resources in the economy, as well as the level of production technology. So therefore, as you can observe in this graph right here, we see that the long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, where price is on the y-axis and output, or real GDP, or the level of production, is on the x-axis. What this is telling us is that it doesn't matter what the price level is. It can be P1 or P2 in the long run. The long-run aggregate supply is going to be determined by the natural rate of output. What this is telling us is that the natural rate of output is the amount that we produce when the economy is operating at the natural rate of unemployment. So we've stripped away all of the short-run factors. We've stripped away the business cycles, the recessions, the expansion periods, and this is the estimated natural rate of unemployment based on, remember, structural factors and frictional factors that occur in our economy. So when we're operating at the natural rate of unemployment, this is going to be the estimated output that we produce, or the natural rate of output. This is going to be determined, again, by the number of resources and the level of technology that we have in our economy. What we see is that shifts in the long-run aggregate supply are going to come only when we have permanent changes in either available resources or the available technology in our economy. As we observe here, this shift out of the long-run aggregate supply curve is showing an increase in long-run aggregate supply, an increase in output over time that is stemming specifically from an increase in available resources or an increase in production technology. Now, what about aggregate supply in the short run? Now, the short-run aggregate supply, remember, is going to show that we have a breakdown of the classical dichotomy. So those nominal and real variables are more closely intertwined. So therefore, what we observe, as you can see here, is an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. This is coming specifically from what we call sticky wages and sticky prices. So because we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, that's going to cause and explain why we have short-run economic fluctuations or business cycles in the economy. Let's explore in a little bit greater detail what we mean by sticky wages and sticky prices. Sticky wages specifically tell us that wages cannot directly adjust right away for changes that we have in the economy. So in other words, our firms are setting wages based on their expectations of what's going to be happening in the near future, specifically what their expected price level is going to be. Now, when there's a difference between the expected price level and the actual price level, firms can't adjust their wages automatically to reflect that difference. You can think of it this way. You have an agreement with your employer that they're going to pay you a certain amount. Just because their expectations are different than reality in terms of what the business conditions are, doesn't mean that your agreement with them can break down immediately to reflect those changes. So firms have wage agreements with their employees. And if the price level is unexpectedly low, they can't simply pay their workers less. In the short run, firms are going to adjust and produce less because of this lower price level. And they're not necessarily going to be able to change their wages. On the other hand, when we think about sticky prices, it's a similar concept. Again, firms set their prices based on their expectations of what's going to be happening with business conditions and with the economy. And if those expectations do not match reality, not all of our firms can change their prices automatically to reflect the new reality. So therefore, what happens is that instead of changing their prices, they're going to adjust the quantity that they supply and adjust the quantity that they are producing in the economy. So because of sticky wages and sticky prices, what we observe is that firms in the short run respond to different price levels by changing the quantity supplied. So that at high price levels, we have a high short run quantity supplied, and at low price levels, we have a low short run quantity supplied, and therefore an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. Now let's think about changes in the aggregate supply. When we have shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve, this is going to come from either permanent changes in resources and technology. So here we would have a change in both the long run and a change in the short-run aggregate supply. Or we could have temporary changes in resources and technology. Here we would have only a change in the short-run aggregate supply, or a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Or when we have adjustments in expectations. So when the expected price level is not equal to the actual price level, in the short run, we have a change in, we see the adjustment in terms of the quantity supplied by firms. But in the long run, what we observe is that firms change their expectations based on the new reality, and therefore we see a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. We'll explain this in a little bit greater detail in Module 3.3. So what have we learned in this module? Well, we've learned about the difference between the long-run and the short-run aggregate supply curves, and the fact that in the long run, the classical dichotomy holds, whereas in the short run, it breaks down. So therefore, we see that in the long run aggregate supply curve doesn't respond to changes in the price level, whereas in the short run, firms do respond to changes in the price level. Also, we've explained why and how we have shifts in the long run aggregate supply curve, and why and how we have shifts in the short run aggregate supply curve. Thanks so much for joining me in Module 3.2 on the aggregate supply.